This is the Lebenthal Report with Michael Hartzman and Dominic Tavella. We'll break down the news, trends, and overall direction of the markets, telling you what may be coming next, investment opportunities, and what to avoid. Now, here are your hosts, Dominic Tavella and Michael Hartzman.
All right, I'm Michael Hartzman, on as always with my partner, Dominic Tavella. Today is Tuesday, January 3rd, 2023. We're back after a couple of weeks. Happy New Year, Dominic. I hope all is well.
All's well with me, Mike, and Happy New Year to you as well. Hopefully this year's a heck of a lot better than last year.
I think it will be. We could finally put a bow on 2022. And in getting ready for the show tonight, Dom, and looking at all the market recaps and the synopsis and you know, the bloody numbers that we went through, one thing that I had forgotten is, just like this year, the market first day of trading was January 3rd, 2022. And I had forgotten that the S&P actually reached an all-time high that day.
It looked like it was going to be a pretty good year after what was a spectacular year in 2021. But you and I think on our very first podcast and then throughout the year, we're pretty adamant that it doesn't feel like it's going to be that kind of year. And fortunately for us and fortunately for the clients, we started playing defense very, very early. And it did not turn out to be a very good year at all. And that's probably being polite, but maybe a little less painful for us. So but grateful to start all over again, Mike. Grateful to start at zero and see where the new year brings us.
Look, there's no way around it. It was not a great year. I'll just do a quick recap of the numbers. The S&P was down 18%. The NASDAQ was down 32.5%. And the Dow Jones was down only about 7%, 6.86. And that's quite frankly because of the few energy stocks that make up the Dow Jones, and the energy sector was up 66% last year. And the next sector that was up was, let me just check real quick, just lost my spot, utilities. So energy was up 66. The next leading sector was utilities, and that was up 1.6.
Yeah.
You know, and then consumer staples was third, down 0.5 point. So yeah, last year was, for a lot of different reasons, risk came off the table. I think one of the reasons was we started the year last year with the Federal Reserve predicting 4 interest rate hikes at the most of 25 basis points each. And we were pretty convinced that they would be done raising interest rates by the midterm elections. And quite frankly, Dom, none of that turned out to be true. And I think we could tie a lot of that in to our guest tonight, who is Natasha Lance Rogoff. And this is a woman who in the early 90s went to Russia to basically bring Sesame Street to Russian children. And I think her appearance tonight is timely because you and I have sat with a lot of portfolio managers this year. And what did they blame the first trigger on in causing all the forecasts to go out the window? It was the war between the Russians and the Ukrainians.
I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that, Mike, as probably not surprising you. I still blame the Fed and its forecasting, which, as we well know, we got a perfect working crystal ball that looks backwards, right? So we know in 2021, they were talking about inflation being transitory and no need to rush raising interest rates at all. And as you alluded to, even in January of last year, they were talking about very mild, benign type rate increases. And that changed dramatically. That mood changed dramatically. And I know we talked about the S&P performance and the NASDAQ, but, you know, people, a decade of overperformance, you know, many people out there, you know, had the FANGs in their portfolio, Mike, the Facebooks and the Netflix and the Amazons and Googles and Apple. And if you own those FANGs type stocks, many of them down 50, 60, 70% last year. So, the 18, 19% for the S&P seems kind of pretty good when you look at what a Netflix did or an Amazon did or some of these other companies. So many people got hurt last year, and substantially worse than the S&P 500 performance.
I agree with you, but the war started in February, I believe, and right after that, Dominic, we started hearing about $5 and $6 and $7 gallon of gasoline, and a lot of it was attributed to this, supply chain disruption, that Russia would create for Western Europe and Eastern Europe. So I don't disagree with you that risk clearly came off the table with the FANG stocks and technology in general because of rising interest rates, right? That's one set of circumstances. And the second set of circumstances was the headlines of the high price of gas and inflation going through the roof, which also made a lot of investors and, more importantly, a lot of consumers very, very nervous.
Very nervous, but look, we can sugarcoat it any way we want, but I think sometime in June, inflation hit a peak of over 9%. Energy was clearly a big component of that. Problems with the supply chain in China and COVID were a really big part of that. People having excess savings and reserves because they weren't spending during the lockdown. Now they could afford to spend, and that means they could bid up and pay just about any price that companies were willing to sell product for or services for, right? Home improvements, think about that. What people were being charged, and people were like, I'll pay it. I don't have a choice. So we were dealing with a scenario where inflation clearly spiraled out of control, way more than the Fed had assumed, and the Fed reacted accordingly. And accordingly means they became very aggressive in their interest rate tightening policy, and that made many of these stocks that we're so big fans of, but their worth, their value, come down substantially, and that hurt. Not only hurt the markets and the major indices, but a lot of investors that held these types of securities, and whether it's the individual names, the ETFs in the growth space or the mutual funds in the growth space, they got hammered. They got hammered pretty hard.
And the people who still are heavily involved in the tech sector will tell you it's not going to get better until we have more focus on when interest rates are going to stop going up. Right.
And I would agree with that, Mike. And I think
too.
a lot of this is common sense. I think that's a point well made on your part. The reasons why we are where we are have not changed just because the clock changed, right? It's great that it's January 1st. It's a brand new year and we can look at the picture and start all over again. But the reality is that many of the issues that got us here in the first place are still here. And until the Fed changes its tone, at the very least, its tone, markets are going to be volatile. The good news, again, is we're prepared. We anticipated it and we're prepared.
I think the general consensus is that the Fed is going to raise interest rates 2 or 3 more times. What I've been reading is 50 basis points 2 times, and then 1 more for 25, kind of get the Fed funds rates about 5%, then hopefully stop. But to your point, people don't react, or the market doesn't react any longer to what the Fed announcement is. They react to the press conference an hour later and parse every word that Jerome Powell says.
Exactly right, Mike. It's kind of almost ironic that the last bunch of rate increases have been spot on what the market was expecting, anticipating, spot on. And the markets rally into that interest rate hike, thinking, okay, we have a good scenario now. We understand it. We got a handle on it. And then Chairman Powell starts to talk, and you can just literally watch the market roll over and go down. So at this point in the game, not so much what they say they're going to do, but what they say after they do it. And we'll pay attention and we'll act accordingly.
And to Jerome Powell's credit, Dom, he has been look. He was way off base in the beginning of the year, but he's been pretty consistent, since May or June in terms of the messaging that the Fed is going to do and what their goal is to get, inflation down, the CPI down. But it's almost as if the market's this petulant child and wants us to hear what they want to hear.
No doubt, Mike. No doubt. If you ask the typical analyst or portfolio manager, what would you like to hear? Sure, yeah, we stopped raising interest rates and inflation is going to go to zero. But that is not reality. The question here going forward is how do we get there? And that's a long conversation for after the break.
So the next couple of weeks, we are going to have portfolio managers and economists on, and we'll be able to get to that.
The experts.
A little more, a little deeper dive. But we're going to take a quick break. We're going to come back with Natasha Lance Rogoff, the author of the Muppets in Moscow. And as I said, this is a woman in the early to mid 90s, tried to bring and successfully did bring, I should say, Russia's version of Sesame Street to Russian children and the harrowing experience that she went through to accomplish that. So we'll be right back with Natasha Lance Rogoff.
Now, back to the Lebenthal Report.
All right, I'm Michael Hartzman, back with Dominic Tavella, and our guest tonight, Natasha Lance Rogoff, the author of Muppets in Moscow. How are you, Natasha?
Very good. Happy New Year to all.
Thank you for joining us, Natasha. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Me too.
Thank you. So, Natasha, I guess we're just going to start right from the beginning. Whose idea was it to bring a Russian version of Sesame Street to Russian children? Did the Sesame Workshop approach the Russian government, or did the Russian government approach you guys with the notion that this might be a good idea?
Well, it's a little bit of both. And the Sesame Workshop, which was then called Children's Television Workshop, is a nonprofit. And they had approached the Congress, the US Congress. So you kind of have to think about what was going on at this time, just after Soviet communism collapsed. And, the whole Western world was euphoric, that there was the prospect of Russia joining the free world. And then Senator Biden at that time was working to get the Congress to provide bipartisan support for a Russian Sesame Street production. And the idea was that the Muppets would be the best ambassadors of idealistic values like tolerance and freedom of expression, which they are. But eventually the Senator Biden got support for the production. And they also had, as part of the discussions at the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee hearing, a representative from the Russian government, Elena Lenskaya, and she explained that, she told the whole subcommittee, we really need something like Sesame Street, and we'd much prefer having Sesame Street to imported programs like Rambo. And that was actually recorded. It was quite amazing. So we were working with the Russian Ministry of Education, and that started a very difficult next 5 years of my life. And I did not expect to be tapped to lead this production at all.
So, Natasha, I can't think of anything more benign and sort of a global ambassador than the Muppets. But you basically had to get the US government involved with the Russian government to approve this project going forward in Russia. Am I getting this correct?
Well, at the time, this was right when, the Soviet Union fell, and there really wasn't much state funding available for film or television at that time. I mean, this was a period of enormous instability in Russia. We didn't know at that time if Russia was going to stay this, or even emerge as a fledgling democracy, or would it revert to communism, or what else would come in the future? Nobody really knew what was going to happen. And, it was into this vacuum that the idea of bringing Sesame Street to Russia and creating a new show that would reflect Russian culture and Russian values, new open society values, of this new country. Because, of course, a lot of the countries had split off and become independent, like Armenia, Ukraine, Georgia. So we're really talking about Russia. But at the same time, the state television entity was still transmitting across 11 time zones. So 1/7 of the world's surface. And the idea was that the Muppets could provide skills and knowledge to children to help them thrive in this new open society. So that was, of course, we were making the show with, eventually our team numbered 400 of, writers, producers, filmmakers, animators, set designers. So it was a huge collaborative venture. And
most of them being Russian, correct?
Oh, yeah, we had only a few Americans involved in the production that were on site, in Russia, most regularly. And then the Americans from the Sesame Street studios in New York would come over and provide workshops. So we had like the guy who is Telly Monster and Snuffleupagus. He trained the puppeteers in the Russian puppeteers. And we had the veteran writers from Sesame Street. So Luis Santiero came over and trained the Russian writers. So it was a real move, and the Russians also came to New York and visited the Sesame Street studio, and they learned, all about the production on that from coming to the United States too.
So Natasha, was there any children programming at the time, or were you trailblazing, this whole new genre of television for Russia?
That's a really great question, because at this time in America, it was the beginning of cable. So we had Nickelodeon. I mean, cable was just blossoming. But in what was the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, that wasn't the case. And television was primarily utilized for propaganda in Soviet times. So the largest production that had been made in television, dramatic production, had 12 episodes. So you think about that, when we're making, 150, episodes of Sesame Street at the same time. So when we first proposed the idea to do that, there was one children's show on television at the time, because it was a period of extreme poverty for production at that time. So the Russian partners said that's impossible. We couldn't possibly do this show with 150 episodes. We ended up doing 52 half hours for the first season, and it was very difficult. We also had to import a lot of the equipment and materials that did not exist in the former Soviet Union. And in addition to that, the approach that the Russian team used to shoot television was entirely different. So an example of that is shooting with sync sound. It was not done then at all. And the dubbing, we had a certain portion of the show that was dubbed Muppet segments. And the Russians had at that time, they were dubbing shows with one person. So you have like this monotone narrator who just talks about, he talks about what the people are saying on the screen. So it's not actors, with acting with emotion. It was called a narration. And we, of course, didn't want to do that. We wanted to find, who's Russian Cookie Monster and who's going to be, Russian Ernie. But 60% of the show was entirely originally shot, including the creation of 3 new Slavic Muppets based on their own culture and a giant neighborhood set. that looks very Russian. It's entirely Russian in its design, and that caused a lot of. In the book, I write about it extensively. What was this neighborhood going to look like? Because it wasn't the Soviet Union anymore. It wasn't pre-revolutionary Russia. So what was this neighborhood going to look like?
So, Natasha, I can't help asking because that's some of the technical problems. But I imagine, Russia coming out of its Cold War environment, that the politics were a big part of it. What you were allowed to say, what you could say, what maybe subtly you try to get away with. I'd love to hear about your adventure there.
Well, there were enormous cultural differences, as you can imagine, precisely because of what you're saying. I mean, we were working with hundreds of people who had come out of 70 years of communism, not one generation, but 3 generations. And there were a lot of difficulties. One in the curriculum seminar, which is the cornerstone of every international Sesame Workshop co-production. We bring together the creative team and education experts to discuss what is going to be the content for the show. And when we did this in Moscow, we were holding it in the monastery, the Russian Orthodox monastery, which was the headquarters of the Russian Orthodox Church. It was where we could rent space. But to me, it was kind of, amazing to be inside this beautiful setting with all these, cupolas and, churches. It just felt very spiritual and intense. And, the discussion that we had, at first the Russian team said we showed them some clips from Sesame Street, from the American show, to familiarize them with the program. And almost immediately they said, well, of course, our show is going to be much more sophisticated than the American one because our children are much smarter. And then there was a whole discussion about the differences in, Soviet, post-Soviet education versus American. And then when we brought up the idea of, how do you teach children about a free market? Because there wasn't one. It didn't exist in Russia before that. Or in the former Soviet Union at all. So, I raised my hand at one point and innocently suggested, well, we could do a scenario about a lemonade stand, children running a lemonade stand. And, as soon as I said it, the whole group just, there was silence. And then, someone said in the group, that's horrible. Children selling things on the street. The only people who do that are criminals and the mafia. And, it's only a few years after the Soviet Union had fallen. So, of course, they thought that because, independent commerce was illegal. And the only people who were engaging in that sort of activity was mafia. So there were many examples of that, including the making of the Muppets themselves, where we showed them images of, various Muppets from different international co-productions. And I had produced the show Plaza Sesamo, which was the Mexican Sesame Street show. So we showed them the Muppets from the Spanish language show, from the Israeli show, and several other Germany, and they just looked at the Muppets and they said, they don't look Russian. They don't look Russian. We're not going to have your Muppets in our Sesame Street. And then the head writer said, Natasha, we have our own revered puppet tradition dating back to the 16th century. So we don't really need your Muppets. So, you were dealing in trying to create this new progressive, innovative Muppet show. We were also dealing with a society that was going through a very difficult period, extreme trauma, humiliation. The whole world had just watched their country collapse. So as the person leading production, I had to be very sensitive to these undertones throughout everything. Otherwise, we would just fail. We would come to, just a point where there could be no compromise.
Natasha, we are bumping up against a break. So before I get into a new topic, let's take a quick break now, and then we'll come back, and we both have a million more questions for you.
Sure.
We'll be right back.
Now, back to the Lebenthal Report.
All right, I'm Michael Hartzman, back with my partner Dominic Tavella, and our guest this evening, Natasha Lance Rogoff. Natasha, let me ask you this. You know, Sesame Street, from its original iteration, always wanted to teach children to be inclusive and patient and about different races and basically, can't we all get along, right, and be tolerant of each other? And obviously now, I think they've taken it to another level, but even in the 90s, that was a big theme. So when you went to create the show in Russia, were you trying to accomplish that, or were you successful in that? Or did you know going in that there were certain barriers you just were not going to be able to break through?
Well, they, in the Soviet Union, they had over 123 different nationalities, and this included Central Asians, Tartars, Chechens. It was a huge swath of land. And of course, when we were developing Sesame Street in Russia for the first time, there was a discussion about inclusivity. And not everything. The show is designed to reflect each of the cultures that we are cooperating with to create an original program. And in Russia, they did not have the same historical experience with race as we did in the US, and they had different races than we did in the US. So, but the goal was to create a show that would promote tolerance and inclusivity. And I can tell you about one time when we showed a clip to the creative team and the education experts in Moscow, which was a clip of a little boy in a wheelchair who was flying a kite. And there was this upbeat song in the background, me and my chair, we go everywhere. And we showed this as an example of inclusivity. And when the clip finished, one of the educators stood up and said, "How can you show children in wheelchairs? It's so exploitative." And this was not the reaction I'd expected from this clip. So then another woman educator raised her hand and said, kind of innocently, "I don't understand. Why would normalny дети, normal children, ever want to watch a TV show with nenormalnie, not normal children?" So when this happened, I was just completely disheartened. And I thought, oh, maybe Russia's not ready for Sesame Street, But then this other woman raised her hand and she said, you Americans don't understand that our country has fallen apart. Our healthcare system has collapsed. And there are children, disabled children, who are trapped in their beds, and they will never have a wheelchair. We can't afford them for all the children with disabilities. So how will these children feel if they see other children on the TV show with wheelchairs? They'll just feel sad. And as she said this, it was like a dagger. You're just like, oh my God, I didn't even occur to me, at the time. And, it also made me realize that, the educators we were working with were really taking their job, seriously. They felt responsible, and they were trying to grapple with the reality of their own experience across, as I said, 11 time zones. But what ended up happening with this afterwards is a very different, than what I had thought. And I write about this in Muppets in Moscow. And, in the end, there was a consensus about how to deal with children with disabilities. And I think that this transformation took place in various aspects of the show, in the music, in the content, but it wasn't immediate. It was a process. And it certainly wasn't, with me saying anything. The group came to this conclusion by communicating with each other and coming up with a compromise themselves. So that's like one example. There are others too, where I was more adamant about a particular, approach for Sesame Street. But that was usually had more to do with wanting the show to be a hit and wanting it to be funny, to have great comedy and great music.
Natasha, myself, Michael, we get invited and we meet with economists and portfolio managers pretty much weekly to hear the latest ideas and insights. And one that we heard quite a number of years ago, Mike, you might be more in tune for when, but a term called BRICS, B standing for Brazil, R for Russia, I for India, C for China, K for Korea. And these were the 5 countries that were not only investable, but had the greatest opportunity for a business coming in there based on where their economies were, their population, the opportunity for business growth. And think of a Starbucks being able to open up a place or a Kentucky Fried Chicken in China. But you're really talking about the challenges of an American business, and we don't like to think of maybe the Muppets as a business, but even if it's a non-for-profit, it's a business, right? You want to be successful. The challenges at a business that is created and conceived in the United States, how do you implant that in another country, another culture? And you're talking about some pretty serious challenges that you had to go through.
That's very true. I mean, this, it wasn't only the Muppets that were coming into the former Soviet Union at this time. It was a flood of investors and business people. You had Pizza Hut, McDonald's. You also had a lot of imported TV shows at the time, but we were very different. We were we were working with people locally to create something that was a totally new and original show that would be a positive force in the society. And we couldn't have done this without the support of both the US government and Russian private investors, because that's who funded Ulica Sesame, which means Sesame Street in Russia. And eventually we had to also get the buy-in from the Russia's largest TV channel, Ostankino, which we did not get until the very end when the show was already produced. So it was a really long process. But in terms of what you're talking about and overcoming a lot of the cross-cultural differences, when I finished Ulica Sesame and I left Sesame Street at the end of it, Sesame Workshop, I was approached by Coca-Cola to come in and help them develop their business in Russia. And of course, that wasn't my thing. It never was going to be. So I said no. But it was obviously a lot of the skills that we needed to have to create a program that would bring the best of Russian and of their other nationalities in the country, the best of their artistry and their passion to create this magnificent show, coupled with the American expertise. I mean, it was difficult, but I'd say the fact that the show became such a huge hit and lasted for 10 years, well into Putin's era, is evidence of our impact. as well as, thinking about the Russians now that are marching out of Russia because they don't want to fight and they don't support the war. And, they grew up on Ulica Sezam. They're in their late 20s and 30s. And it's the same age cohort in Ukraine that are fighting for their independence. And they are also children of Sesame Street, of Ulica Sezam, because the show aired in Ukraine too.
So Natasha, let's talk about the correlation of the war in Russia going on right now. And it seems to be that any oligarch or businessman that speaks out against the war seems to fall out of windows frequently. And you mentioned in your book, assassination attempts and real heavy duty stuff. One person it wasn't an attempted assassination. He was assassinated. So number one, why did that even happen? What were they trying to scare you? What was the motive behind that? And did you ever reach the point where you said, this is just nuts and, not worth it?
Yeah, many times, like every week, practically. But it was, our first investor was a budding Russian oligarch. And I was with my business partner, Russian partner, we negotiated a deal with him to become a sponsor for Ulica Sezam, for Sesame Street. And, we were ecstatic. It had taken months to even have a meeting with this guy. And, there was at one point we were sitting with him and, even he kept asking, I was explaining that the Muppets are going to be original Muppets designed with Russian designers and the Henson team. And he kept saying, so, he says in Russian, so no big bird, but hearing this oligarch say big bird over and over, and I was just like, this is so fun, And then 3 weeks later, the same car that we had been in talking about the deal, that car was blown up and he barely survived. He had severe burns and he lived, which is, he was later killed in London many years later, ostensibly in suspicious circumstances in London during the Putin era. But then a few months later, our broadcast partner, who had agreed to air the show on Russia's largest television station, he was a great man, Vlad Listyev, who was trying to bring press freedom to Russian television. And he was also fighting corruption inside the TV station. It had to do with advertising revenue, which was being infiltrated by the mafia to some extent. And he was our confidant and really so important in terms of giving us advice along the way and how to navigate this, medieval, television industry. And he was shot after he left the studio one evening, and he was murdered.
Oh God.
But that happened to another person, another person we negotiated the deal with 9 months later. So this was a product of that time period. And as we see today, it never stopped.
So Natasha, on a happier note, let's talk about those characters over your right shoulder, which I think are Russian Muppets, if I'm correct.
Yes, the big blue full body puppet is Zeliboba. And then the Kubik, the orange hand puppet. And then the rod puppet is Businka, the pink little full of energy puppet. And it was fascinating creating the blue full body puppet because he's based on a Russian folklore character called Domovoy, which is a spirit who protects the hearth in the home. And this evolved into, he's also a spirit of nature. So this character has leaves and twigs and moss sewn into his coat. And he lives inside a 40-foot tree. So that was, a very Russian character. And his personality is, playful and helpful, in line with the Russian team's prioritization on trying to create a neighborhood where people treated each other with kindness. But there were many, many debates, which I talk about in the book, including his color. Some of the Russian colleagues objected to him being blue because the word blue, goluboi, means gay in Russian. And one of the writers said, people will think the puppet's gay. So we had all these discussions that you just can't even imagine. And my favorite one was when the colors for these Muppets were determined, the Russian creative team had to consult the philosophical treatise written by the great painter Vasily Kandinsky. And he wrote a book called The Theory of Color. And in this book, he writes about how different colors are equated with different emotions. So that was how we had to pick the colors for these Muppets. And I would say that, for instance, Big Bird is yellow, but according to Kandinsky, yellow causes madness in children.
Fans of Big Bird might disagree.
Yeah, Big Bird will disagree. But if you look at the Russian show, the Ulitsa Sesame, it's the most beautiful production that, nobody can argue with the fact that, Russian artists have contributed so much to the world. And this is especially why, it's so tragic now to see what's happening in Ukraine, perpetrated by Putin's government. And it has been so difficult for my former colleagues as well, who were vocal against the war. And many of them had to leave within 24 hours, leave Russia, because they were in danger of being imprisoned for 15 years.
Natasha, does any of this great work survive? Is it functioning anywhere? Is it operating anywhere?
You mean the show?
Yeah. And the characters.
The show lasted for 10 years. And as I meet people around the world who are from Russia, Georgia, Ukraine, Armenia, I always ask them, do you know Ulitsa Sesame? And it is incredible how popular the show was. And, many of the people I talk to me about who their favorite Muppet is, and they'll start reciting some of the songs. And that's the legacy that we left, that was started by Jim Henson and continued, to be expressed in Russia. But I don't, you couldn't have this show in Russia now. And it's very sad to see.
Natasha, if anyone wants to learn more about your adventures and your story, the name of the book is Muppets in Moscow, and what's the best way for someone to pick up the book if they wanted to?
It's on Amazon, Muppets in Moscow, the unexpected true story of making Sesame Street in Russia. And if you want to reach me, you can go to my website, which is just my name, and it's natashalancerogoff.com.
Natasha, this was a great conversation. It was a great way to start the new year. And we thank you for your time this evening.
Thank you, Natasha.
Thank you so much. And I would only add, we hope for peace in Ukraine.
Absolutely.
Take care.
Have a great evening.
Natasha.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
We'll be right back.
Now, back to the Lebenthal Report.
All right, I'm Michael Hartzman, back with Dom Tavella. Dom, Natasha did a great job. It was so fascinating. You were talking on the break, God forbid if if I'm with a backer of something I'm trying to do and they get blown up in the car that I sat in 3 weeks ago, I might be on the first plane out of there. So I
Talking
give her
about
credit for
commitment
hanging in there.
and courage, Mike, to just be in that environment. And I know I kind of mentioned it a little bit when we had her on, but how many meetings were we in with the portfolio managers and strategists that you had to buy the bricks, you had to buy the bricks, you had to buy the bricks. These countries that offered, just tremendous opportunity for business growth. I don't think many of these people understood back then the challenges. Even think about Coca-Cola, for God's sakes, with their resources, the challenges these businesses had and still have. Think about today of operating in these foreign countries.
Yeah, look, and right now the country's a shambles, the currency's a shambles, and no one talks about the BRICS anymore. They talk about the BICS. They've eliminated the R. So no economist, I think, is excited about, forget the war in Russia for a minute. Even before the war with Ukraine, Russia's economy was deteriorating rapidly.
And I agree. Russia is uninvestable at this point, but you still hear about China. You certainly hear about India now.
Oh, yeah.
As the next great opportunity, and the opportunities are there. We hear about them all the time, but I think sometimes common sense overrules greed. Greed overrules common sense, and there are challenges. There are challenges to businesses operating there: political, economic, cultural, and she mentioned the mafia more than a few times. Crime, right? So not as easy. It's easier said than done.
Look, I give the folks at Sesame Street all the credit in the world for trying and actually pulling it off. And I hope the citizens benefited from that. But what an adventure that she went through for those 10 years. And she's probably right. She could never get that show on Russian air today. I think it would be highly unlikely.
And Mike, she hinted at it again. Think about the decade that this show was on and other shows like it, where the younger people in the country now saw a different culture and a different attitude, and now they're being asked to get a rifle and go to war. Right. It's a seed that was planted, and again, the shame is that innocent people on both sides are dying, and it's completely unnecessary.
So, Dom, we're off to a good start for 2023 in terms of our guests, in terms of our podcast. And we will be back next week with a new show. And once again, we're out of time. And Happy New Year, my friend.
Happy New Year. Great start to the year, Mike, with the podcast. And we've gotten a lot of compliments over the past 12 months. People seem to like it. I'm not quite sure why, but they do. So as long as they like it, we'll keep doing them. Right, Mike?
Clearly, you're a sparkling personality, Dominic.
Yeah, I don't think so, but thanks, Mike. Happy New Year.
Have a good night, everybody.
All our clients.